Hi everyone. Um, this paper was the first paper I think I did ever based on my PhD research, and this was for the University of York's MA Public History grad conference. I did not do my MA at York. I was they just put the call out for papers and I submitted. Um, this paper is based on interviews I conducted for my PhD about Northamptonshire's post-war Caribbean communities. Northamptonshire is a county that is both in the East Midlands, composing of both countryside and industrial towns: Northampton, Wellingborough, Kettering, and Corby. I have now finished those interviews. So this paper, I'm going to read this paper as I read it last year when I was in the middle of the interviews, but I've now finished. So now that I've finished, I've got a broader understanding of what my project is and what it can be. Um, So from as early as 1948, Caribbean people arrived in Northampton looking for a better life. A beginning of my story may start with Winston Nelson, for example, who came to Northampton in that year after killing Nazis for the British state during the Second World War as a pilot. I interviewed his daughter Barbara. His wife, Phyllis Turner, was English, and their relationship opposed the prejudice faced by many mixed couples in this era, as also there were many Black American servicemen in the Northamptonshire area during the Second World War, as there was across the country, including in Lancashire with the battle, which culminated as well in 1943 with the Battle of Bamber Bridge. And also there was racist skirmishes in Launceston, in Cornwall, and I'll point you towards Kate Warren's work on that. And also there was a skirmish as well in Portsmouth, near Cosham, near Portsmouth as well that year. So the Black American presence in the United Kingdom during the war came with American attachments of their white superiors trying to impose that Jim Crow-esque racism that would fly in America. And when they tried to do it here, in some cases they met resistance, because if a black Americans defend themselves here, they won't get the full force of the American criminal justice system thrown at them. Unlike in America, if they try to defend themselves, it would be another story entirely. Anyway, um, many of these black men had children with local white women in Britain, across Britain, which culminated with at least 2,000 mixed children from GIs and white women. Black GIs were also stationed at local bases in Northamptonshire villages, including Hayford and Croughton near Kettering as well. Stories like that of the Nelsons represent a largely unwritten history of Northamptonshire's Caribbean diaspora. Through my interviews, there have been testimonies about jobs and housing that are not too different to that of the cities. Families of 6 to 1 room, for example, colour bars like pubs and clubs, and racism in employment and education. For example, one of my interviewees told me that on coming to Wellingborough, that her mother Sylvia McLawrence, so my auntie Angela, told me that her mother Sylvia McLawrence did not train at Northampton General because in those days NGH did not employ black nurses. So when Sylvia came to Northampton from Jamaica in the 60s, she trained at St Edmunds on the Wellingborough Road, whilst many others also trained in psychiatric nursing at St Andrews and St Crispin's. The stories of healthcare are stories about racism, but also stories about togetherness where black nurses made friends that have lasted all their lives. Today, NGH does present itself as a very forward-thinking organisation, but to my knowledge, one of the only hospitals in the country that did not employ black nurses until the 70s, whilst most other places did. And I'm not sure if that's for racist reasons or for other reasons, but we just don't know. In fact, as health minister in the 60s, Enoch Powell actively recruited black nurses from the Caribbean So it really makes me question, why didn't Northampton General employ black nurses until the 70s? Anyway, unique to Northampton is our shoe and boot industry. When I interviewed Jenny LeBon about her parents and her life, she told me her mum and dad worked in Jinks Shoe Factory in Wellingborough, where the labour force was upheld by Caribbean workers. Jenny's grandfather, Ozzie King, came to Wellingborough from St Vincent in 1963-64. Jenny was born in Kettering Town in 67 to her mother, Jean King, and her father, Reuben LeBon, uh, who were from St Vincent but of Indian heritage, who 3 generations before Ozzie had come to St Vincent from Madras, India, as indentured labourers. Reuben LeBon, untold, enjoyed partying like many Caribbean people in that era. In Wellingborough, there were blues parties at Wellingborough African Caribbean Association, which is still on Rock Street, which it has been since 1987. But prior to that, it was the it was the headquarters for the local youth provision, and they used to do blues and stuff there as well. Then, even back to the 70s, many of my participants or storytellers that told me of their memories of watching blues dance parties. So, where there would also be food as well. So frying pork, frying chicken, alcohol. In some cases, the children told by family members to go upstairs while adults were scrubbing down the wallpaper. So watching them grinding on each other, a form of sex without having sex. So some pubs were unsafe for black people. So that's why they had blues dances. Blues parties were a direct reply to the colour bars at the mainstream white clubs. My grandmother told me that her auntie, Diane, or Auntie Dinah, who lived on Vernon Terrace in Abington in Northampton, had blues parties in her house. People would pay on the door. Of course, with the food too, curry goat, curry chicken, patties, plantain, ackee and saltfish, fried fish. I hear stories of people emptying their front room for the night to make space for the dance floor, and they would bring in the sound system, massive wardrobe-sized speakers. My great grandparents had parties too, and people would bring their kids and send them upstairs with the other kids. So talking to my grandparents, they remember it being a wonderful time because of community and everybody was together. However, these discourses around employment and social life have mainly centered on the Caribbean elders who had vastly different experiences to their children, and also the first generation of British children, so children that came from the Caribbean and the children that were born in England or the UK. Trevor Hall started his music career as a selector DJ at 13 in 1970. In those days, Trevor told me about that when Caribbean families went on trips to the beach, very white spaces, very much in the language of Corey Fowler's book, The Green and Pleasant Land. There'll be sound clashes between different towns. Each group had also had their own cricket teams, domino teams, and they would compete on that level. Trevor talked about him linking up with Duku and Eddie White at these sounds as they came up together in Northampton. Trevor at 16, with his friends, bought out his uncle Count Shelley sound system, Count Shelley's Sound from Tottenham as well. And this is around 1973. At the heart of sound system culture, there was an ethos of black pride, self-determination, and also spirituality. Like with the Matafankanta youth movement, so a local Rastafarian organization founded in 1977, the inspiration came from the African continent. In the early 70s, a more conservative Caribbean generation in ways looked down upon their children's generation, who embraced a politics that rejected the tools of whiteness, respectability, and generally looking European, rejecting straightening your hair, rejecting so-called respectable clothes. In some ways, the Rasta culture that sat within Britain at the time, especially within England, but Britain, and Matafankanta was a challenge to the earlier generation who arrived by ship and by plane in suits and nice dresses, looking to better themselves, taken in by the myths of Britain paved with gold. Many, many sound system events took place at Matafankanta Centre on Sheep Street in Northampton, In the early 70s, Lee Bryan and his friends drove a van from Northampton, sorry, not from Northampton, from London to the Gambia. Whilst there, they were inspired by Gambian kids who owned a youth centre on a beach. They brought that idea back. When they returned home, the Matafankanta ethos started at Lee Bryan's house in Northampton, and every night his house was rammed up for weeks, full of people wanting to know about the trip to Africa. Eventually, they squatted the Salvation Army citadel, and they were confronted by the police. They fought for the building, and that's how Matafankanta started, from a group of young people wanting to better themselves, and did so against a culture that was happy to see young black people in states of inferiority and disadvantage. This was reportedly the first black self-help organisation in Britain. They were not about going to the state for help. Institutions like the local authority were enablers, as Lee told me. Matafankanta means come guard yourself against self-destruction. To articulate the material circumstances of black young people impacted by state violence. Indeed, this was compounded by the judgment of their parents as part of a wider grift of respectability politics. This movement empowered black Northamptonians to do it for themselves. It became a hub of Rasta culture and sound system, a vessel for artists who later performed in many of the cities. Additionally, the first black football team in Northampton was convened there. And this was done through past Phil Plummer, called the Persuaders. That team was called the Persuaders. Their ethos of help not only challenged white organisations, but also black organisations that wanted to be included in the whiteness, to put it bluntly. In large, these were the Windrush children and also the first generation British kids who were excluded by white people and also their own parents because they did not subscribe to the politics of respectability, including some cases, or many cases, to lock their hair, so dreadlocks. By its very nature, it was a form of decolonisation that upset the Windrush elders and white people. I mean, I was told it got so bad at one point that the local West Indian club had a no dreadlocks rule. But the only evidence I have for that is anecdotal, and I believe them, to be honest, as well. So, um, so after doing the interviews, I've heard stories about jobs, housing, identity, activism, and many more. I've also had people talk about the trauma. For the Windrush children, many were left in the Caribbean for many years to be raised by grandparents and other relatives before coming here. So the attachment trauma is not something that some ever recovered from. Nadine White's film Barrel Children explores this. However, for those that were born here, other forms of attachment trauma presented. One of my participants told me she lived with relatives in the first years of her life in Northampton, as her mother had to go to work in America. What was supposed to be 1 month turned into a whole year with her relatives that she describes as familial, but like foster care. For her and many of her age group who were now in their 60s, growing up was traumatic. Their school experiences in many cases were about juggling education with survival from racism, and for many, there were fights. They were in fights every day. However, with whatever walk of life, the Caribbean stories of Northamptonshire have shown me that both the elders, their children, and their children were all very ambitious individuals with high standards and did not do jobs in halves, including employed jobs, parties, community work, and really everything they turned their hand to. Northamptonshire has had a Caribbean story since 1948, while Northampton Town and Wellingborough also had focal points. In Northampton, many Caribbean families lived in Abington, and in Wellingborough, that was later on in Queensway, the Queensway estate. Meanwhile, further out to Kettering, there was not really a community. I'm told Caribbean people in Kettering looked to Northampton or Wellingborough for belonging. In Banbury, on the Oxfordshire-Northampton border, out in the sticks, one of the families I talked to from Barbados, one of the few in the area, had the option of Oxford and Northampton. Oxford too has its own Caribbean history. Written, published works about post-war Caribbean communities have enlarged, revolved around places such as Notting Hill and Brixton in London, Handsworth in Birmingham, and possibly in places like Moss Side in Manchester. My project centres on my home county, Northamptonshire. The decentre popular focuses on the cities through the production of a new work of creative non-fiction based on all history testimonies. So my PhD is a creative writing PhD, not a history PhD. So accessible history texts about Caribbean communities in provincial Britain are lacking in the mainstream. Though many Caribbean people moved to Britain or cities from the 50s, these are not the only places that have a Windrush history. So my thesis looks at Northamptonshire as one of the sites of Caribbean settlement from as early as 48, including the first generation of children that follow. So that's the abstract. So lastly, in 2021, I joined my friend Shireen Ingram's constituted community group, Northampton, where they were doing a door-to-door hamper service to Caribbean elders during lockdown. At their doors, the elders wanted to tell us stories. And this is one of the inspirations behind my PhD. These are people that lived, worked, and thrived in Northamptonshire, and yet their story has been eclipsed by major cities. Here I'm drawing on the words of 3 generations of Caribbean people in Northamptonshire to tell some stories of my area between 1948 and 1990. So the originals who came, and then their children, and then in some cases the second generation of children as well. So Generation X, boomers, and very like the older so in some cases the very older millennials on the peak end, as well. Okay, so these are people that lived, worked, and thrived in Northants, and yet their story has been eclipsed by the cities. Here I've drawn several generations, and it starts with the original Windrush and continues to include the children and my parent generation. So that first generation of British Caribbean youngsters who carved out their own spaces. Today, many of them still carry those stories in their bodies, challenging the systems that still govern their lives. As Bob Marley sang in, as Bob Marley sang, no chains around my feet, but I'm not free. I know I'm bound here and kept in captivity. As always, if you enjoyed this, leave a comment, and if you've got questions, just comment, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you very much.